our distinguished speaker, Professor Spivak, who's a university professor at Columbia. She was actually the initial Avalon Foundation professor in the humanities there. She was first of many things. The first of Andrew Mellon Professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh before teaching at Columbia. She was also, she was one of the first university professors. She was the first university professor in 2007 at Columbia University. She teaches English.
No, I should correct you right away.
Okay.
The first and only woman of color. Columbia University has had university professors for God knows how long.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for correcting me on that. Okay. So the first of many, so yes, okay. So then at Columbia, she teaches English and the politics of culture. She was educated at Presidency College, University in Calcutta, at Cornell University, where she got an MA in English and in comparative literature. Her visiting appointments have taken her to many places, including France, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, Germany. She has been a fellow of the National Humanities Institute, the Center for the Humanities at Wesleyan, the Humanities Research Center at the Australian National University, the Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, the Rockefeller Foundation at Bellagio, and many other distinguished visiting positions. In 1986, she also began a career of activist commitments that took her into rural primary health care and educational work in Bangladesh and involved her with many feminist global social movements. Also in 1986, she established her own rural elementary school in the two most backward districts in West Bengal, India. Her success is measured by the fact that the first 4 were closed by feudal opposition after 20 years of labor because rural youth were beginning to demonstrate independent judgment. She continued her work with several schools that are a challenge to her project of supplementing vanguardism. Continuing with this work, she has come to recognize a deep kinship with Gramsci and with Dubois, and you'll hear today the second of 3 lectures. Her books include Myself Must I Remake in 1974, In Other Worlds, 1987, The Post-Colonial Critic in 1988, Outside the Teaching Machine in 1993, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason in 1999, Death of a Discipline in 2003, and recently released Other Asias in 2008. She is the recipient of the Translation Prize in 1987 for the Sahitya Akademi, the National Academy of Literature in India. She has been elected to the Advisory Board of the English Institute, to the Executive Board of the International Center for Writing and Translation, to the Analytical Circle of the newly established British think tank Zamin, and to a senior fellowship at the School of Criticism and Theory, to the Belgrade Circle, and so on and so forth. She is active in the international women's movement, the struggle for ecological justice, and rural literacy. Her influence has been felt in art and architecture, law and political science, in curatorial practices here and abroad. Her focus has remained in the education in the humanities at both ends of the spectrum, from elementary to post-tertiary, as the best lasting weapon to combat imperialism. She is therefore engaged deeply in the project of institution building in the United States and other places as well. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
Thank you, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. But one correction I will make that I have to make for many, many introductions. Okay, so don't worry about it. People make this mistake, but I have to correct it because I think it's the best thing I have ever written. That is to say, the title of my 3rd or 4th book, depending on whether you count Derrida, is not Outside the Teaching Machine. It's outside in the teaching machine. I think that's the best thing I've ever written. Okay, so therefore you will forgive me if I correct you. It's outside in the teaching machine, not outside the teaching machine. I ain't outside the teaching machine, as I say, sitting in this room. Otherwise, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Anyway, so yesterday I didn't read a bit of my my lecture because I went exactly. See, today again we're starting at 4:20. And 4:20 is like a really strange thing for an Indian, okay? And especially seeing Vivek Bal is already laughing. We don't say 4:20, obviously, it's 4:20, at least in Bengali. And what is it? It means you're full of, well, I don't use the word, let's say hot air, okay? Because it's the number on the penal code for petty larceny, okay, 420, section 420. So therefore, 420 is a wonderful moment to begin. And this is, surely there is a, and in fact, if I talk nonsense, again, I'm not using the word that springs to my lips, then what a Bengali or an Indian would say, you know, 420. So therefore, it's a very fine moment to begin. I didn't share this with you yesterday, but I am sharing it with you today. I'll stop exactly at 5:10 because I think 50 minutes is a good time, after which people kind of start being bored. And then wherever I am, I will begin there for the third lecture. When I come to 50 minutes on the third lecture, I will ask you if you want to hear to the end. Otherwise, it'll appear in print. Okay, yesterday, you know, how many boring lectures have you heard? You know, people going on and on. That's because I stop on 50 minutes, man. It's true. Well, let's not talk about it. We won't go there. We won't go there. Anyway, so yesterday I mentioned a politics of reading, yeah, the way one reads. And again, my former students who are in this room will know that where I get it from, and that indeed we try to follow it. If there's anything I teach, this is what I teach. And so I'll repeat myself. Since it is impossible to find someone who is completely politically correct, even as I do not excuse, I also do not let the accusation throw out the thinking out of court. If it seems an important enough text, I try to enter its protocols. I explained yesterday how protocols are different from rules. I try to enter its protocols, its private grammar, so that I can find a spot in the text where I can locate myself and turn it around, perhaps against its own grain, or perhaps to make it more faithful to itself, its declared convictions, as Mary Prince did for the abolitionists. Do not excuse, do not accuse, enter, earn the right, turn it around, and use. That's the politics. Now, I want to tell you, we are going to talk about Rosa Luxemburg a little today, right? And in Rosa Luxemburg's text, and we will, as we walk in, after I've read about the dream, as we walk in, we will actually see where Gramsci chides Rosa Luxemburg, calling her Rosa, for being only too economistic and not taking the political and passion and so forth in. But I would like to say that if you read Rosa Luxemburg's The Mass Strike with interest, you will find that when she, in her chapter 6, when she corrects the Germans for never finding the right moment, that's that moment of transgression. Rosa Luxemburg, in fact, says, do not look for the correct moment. And this lecture series is not on Rosa Luxemburg, but when I do speak for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Europe, this is where I will locate myself and turn. Okay, so I'll just read what she says is, the attitude of many trade union leaders to this question is generally summed up in the assertion, we are not yet strong enough to risk such a hazardous trial of strength as a mass strike. Now remember, everybody was saying, why did Dubois find it at the wrong moment, right, yesterday? Now this position is so far untenable that it is an insoluble problem to determine the time in a peaceful fashion by counting heads when the proletariat are, quote, strong enough for any struggle. The tacit assumption is that the entire working class of Germany, down to the last man and the last woman, must be included in the organization before it is strong enough to risk a mass action, which then, according to the old formula, would probably be represented as, quote, superfluous, unquote. So you get the point. I mean, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but some of you who've taken my Marx course here will remember that this is exactly the way Marx speaks in the one place about proletarian revolution in the 18 Brumaire. There is no place for it. So either we are not all ready, or when we are ready, it is superfluous. So you don't look for a place. You don't look for, like, was he correct? This is where I was, right? So I'm not going to stay there now. I'm going to do what I promised yesterday. Yesterday, we looked at Du Bois using the words dictatorship of the proletariat and general strike in his Black Reconstruction, and we had, for me, a very positive discussion at the end. I learned a good deal, okay? But what I said, it was part of the first lecture, that I was taking the dream as my model of, my allegory of reading, okay? And I explained what, I'm not going to repeat the explanations, I explained what I meant by allegory of reading, the dream. And also, in answer to a very fine question by Bhrigupati, I don't know if he's here today, but yes, he is, very fine question by him, I talked about the fact that I was using that word in a very literal way, but also in a way that, of course, carried a lot of charge, my dream, right? So when I compared this to Marx's double-edged use of the word social, the social that you understand when you say socialized medicine, for example, and social in the general humanist sense that Marx inherited, and I believe it's because that was never clarified that we have had a lot of problems. But at any rate, I am certainly guilty of using the word dream in those two ways, and it was to an extent to kind of win your approval. Now, let me read the part from lecture 1, which I didn't read because I stopped. See, there's no summary today before, so I think we are cool. Okay, so I want to use the dream, or rather dream work, to keep my method open-ended. Okay, bear with me now. You have to be very indulgent here, and don't run to that mistake of nothing but, that she's being nothing but psychoanalytic. No. And it's think about how I'm not, in fact, being nothing but psychoanalytic. Why specifically the dream work? Because in the most literal sense, everyone dreams at night, or in the afternoon, or whatever time when we're not sleeping, when we're sleeping. Both reason and the dream work are available to all of us. Although all of the neuroscientists, except the man from the Air Force, told us over and over again on 9/11/2009 at the UN that, quote, a new morality, unquote, for the world will not emerge from the domain of neuroscience, it cannot be denied that computation and neurobiology have taken a whack at mere reason. I'm using, of course, Kant's phrase, the fourth critique, which is not called the fourth critique, religion within the bounds of mere reason, bloße Vernunft. I'm using that mere reason, which Kant calls morally lazy, but capable of the syllogisms that we call reason, so rational choice, all that stuff. So the computation and neurobiology have taken a whack at mere reason, but the dream work has remained unclaimed, except by practicing analysts who revised the intuition of all cultures everywhere, all named and unnamed religious systems, shamanisms, healing systems, etc., that dreams have something to do with the part of the mind that is not reason, and they manage it. When we say all human beings share reason, we might as well say all experiencing beings. Davidson's work, Can Animals Think, should really be revised as Can Animals Dream, and we can say it will remain a question. So when we say all human beings share reason, we mean that we can all produce some version of evidentiary syllogisms. This is an invaluable unifier, but it is also infinitely fragile, as events in the world have always demonstrated, by seeming always to break all rules of reason as we can reasonably deduce. The commonality of reason is managed by each individual, by the work of the dream. Today we are being told that because rational choice is bad as a tool of economic predictions, economics should be taught with a healthy dose of the humanities. Joseph Stiglitz should go toward Keynes. But the one thing that Joseph Stiglitz is not going to be able to do is get that part of Keynes, which is Bloomsbury Group, which is much closer to what I'm talking about. This awareness that reason, fragile, invaluable, wonderful, unifier, is managed for each one of us by the work of the dream. Once you enter the humanities, you are entering an area that is neither irrational nor rational. The peculiar nature of the imagination, access to which can perhaps be given by a reasonable approach to dreaming. Europeans, because of first access to capital, and remember what I said yesterday, that immediately my friend Rosa Morris puts up her hand and says, no, no. And I said to her, look, don't do a Marvin Harris on me, okay? I know all about China and what the Cambridge historians say about India, but you also know in this room when I say first access to capital, et cetera, et cetera. So if we want to talk about it, Q&A, that's cool. But I'm not saying this because I don't know the opposite argument, which seems to me always a little tendentious. Europeans, because of first access to capital, which is the abstract as such. I'm not talking about capitalism, I'm talking about capital. Which is the abstract as such and requires that society be run according to its rules as much as possible, have been good at translating a one-size-fits-all model of philosophical rational critique into everyday life. This is what someone was asking me about organic intellectuals. See, this is what Gramsci would call the best organic intellectuals of capitalism. Many people who don't read Gramsci carefully think organic intellectual simply is a very nice word. No, it depends on what you're organic to. You are organic to a mode of production, according to Gramsci. So if you're organic to slavery, then you're a bad organic intellectual. But anyway, this thing of being able to translate a one-size-fits-all model of philosophical rational critique into everyday life, this is the best of the organic intellectualism with capitalism. One of the most brilliant examples of something midway is Freud's rationalization of how the dream works. Condensation, putting many meanings on one word, like a metaphor. Displacement, shifting it one notch to the next slot, like a metonym. Overdetermination, undoing the condensation metaphor by way of a private grammar. And secondary revision, scrambling the previous steps so the dream keeps it secret and becomes readable at the same time. Condensation, displacement, overdetermination, secondary revision. The classic Freudian formula, worked out during the same years that Dubois was elaborating The Souls of Black Folk. The formula is certainly as, quote, scientific, not that I care, as any literary critical method of analyzing rhetoric, as I said yesterday, all of which depend on simple models of human motivation. When you read according to rhetorical, figurative lists and so on, you're looking at 16th century models of the psyche at best, sometimes even older. You look at classical rhetoric, for example, you're looking at periphrasis, and you're looking at apostrophe, you're looking at prosopopeia, you're looking at all of these rhetorics. In the center of each one of them is an intention of the author to write this way. And what kind of psychological model are you looking at? Ancient. So that to an extent, this stuff that I just said, Dumas knew this actually, it is just as scientific as looking at literary criticism in any kind of figurative way. So I am temperamentally unsuited to taking any theory step by step and applying it to a text so that it can become an example of the theory. I have never written this way, and I cannot write this way. I think it's an insult to the text. you internalize the theoretical stuff. So I will certainly not be looking at Du Bois and myself as exactly following this formula that I just gave you. Thus, that for me is a useless exercise. I am talking about the dream rationalized as an indication of my allegory of reading. And as I said yesterday, in an allegory of reading, you don't say that the dream and reason are opposites cancelling each other. What you say is each produces the other as concept and metaphor. They don't cancel each other. Without the concept of metaphoricity, metaphors can't work. And without understanding that all concepts are written metaphorically, concepts are taken in an unexamined and silly way, and thereby a lot of destructive behavior in the world happens. And including, was he correct in saying it was proletarian dictatorship, and so on. And one of my friends said yesterday, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie works. We really have to break that down, because those are big metaphorical descriptions that are taken as if they're conceptual. Anyway, so I'm not going to, that's my allegory of reading. The creative mind is more than the island of reason. The creative mind is more than the island of reason, even when it is doing sociology and history. I keep the work of the dream in mind to get me beyond mere reason, the lowest common denominator of the syllogism. This is necessary to understand cusp people like Du Bois, who were doing something counterintuitive to their group. So the whole group thinks one way. And these counterintuitive intellectuals who travel to all kinds of people, they cannot be just C.L.R. James, where I started yesterday, they cannot be just tied down to the group's intuitions. And this is why sometimes it takes a great long time, sometimes in the case of some ancient texts, thousands of years for them to yield up their, to unweave their web. So this is necessary to understand cusp people like Du Bois, who was doing something counterintuitive to his group, not the vigorous common sense of the best of us. In reading people, or what we want to have happen, quite often, especially in the kind of primitivist assumption about how the suffering really keep their souls intact and they really know everything, etc. It's really what we want. It's our desire speaking, and therefore we decide that it is fulfilled. Abhishek isn't here today, but these horrible things that are happening on the left at home in a place like Lalgod, okay? And I see somebody who's written an article for Monthly Review. Okay, now I'm with these people, as the introduction was saying. I mean, I have a sense of them. I teach with them, and so on. And this person has, this is what happens all the time, and I'll talk about it also. You fit whatever is happening according to your desires, and it becomes a Marxist phenomenon. And so there is a woman who refused the help of the government to be, to get her child delivered, right? And she, in this Monthly Review thing, has become like a female Henry David Thoreau. I know these people. No, she's afraid of the government. That's a very different thing. She's not doing civil disobedience. And we have to understand what it is. It's the citizen who is not able to use the structure of the state as if it's answerable to her, right? So therefore, what I would like to say is that therefore some of these folks are counterintuitive to us, and therefore the intuitions of the group would like to kind of cut them down to size and say, it must be this that he's saying. This is also a problem with Marx. Just a couple of more things about the dream work. Du Bois is, of course, not literally dreaming. He's recoding collectivity when he says that black reconstruction is a general strike. Stathis Gourgouris, a native Greek, has written most effectively about the recoding of a collectivity in Dream Nation, an account of the establishment of Hellenic Greece as the origin of Europe after the defeat of the Ottomans. He takes Freud's idea of secondary revision as far as it will go, says that the dream as we know it is the ruin of a dream. For Freud, secondary revision makes the manifest text of the dream readable, right? But Gourgouris says, talking historically, using the analogy for nation formation, that the dream as we dream it is the ruin of a dream. for the narrative of its work has been annulled there. So keep this in your mind, okay, this thing, the allegory of reading as dream work. This is not sort of psychoanalytical symptomatic diagnostic reading, no. I'm talking about some way of finding a manner of thinking that will free me from the morally lazy outlines of mere reason, which is close kin to rational choice. That's all I'm talking about. Literary criticism should not be done that way. One more short paragraph, and then I promise that I'll be done with talking about the dream, and then I go to today's lecture. Reading, thinking about the dream, I realize that I am myself over-determining. Remember, one of the words in that formula. Undoing the condensations, things that are all, yesterday I was doing this with the general strike, and what is it the site of, etc. And I was using, as Brigu pointed out, the metaphorical word, Dubois's dream, Gramsci's dream, right? I am myself over-determining, undoing the condensations and displacements in Dubois's text, not just by way of his private grammar, but by way of a grammar broadly shared by those of us who want to wrench Marx away from his European lineaments, because even as we agree with Benedict Anderson or Kathleen Collins that the non-Europeans simply used Marx as a name for their brand of goon politics, we also want to take it away from there on our own. So this is why I was reading. It's not like we didn't know this. We didn't need Benedict Anderson and Kathleen Collins to tell us this. So to an extent, that's the whole context within which I was over-determining Dubois's condensations and displacements. This, I believe, is how Du Bois and Gramsci both read Marx. Remember, subaltern, African subaltern. Du Bois is hearing the African subaltern speak world historically. And Gramsci is taking us in Europe, beyond Europe, by looking at the subaltern, capital logic. This, I believe, is how Du Bois and Gramsci both read Marx, but the grammar of the dreams were different. I talked about that too. The question that I'm asking then in my attempt to over-determine a reading of Du Bois is not, was he correct in calling the Black Reconstruction a general strike, or rather the flight of the Negroes, but rather what might have been the stakes in such a naming. I would, of course, like to suggest that he was himself attempting to over-determine an event in his own history, not to re-territorialize it out of an African-American past, no. So I cited C.L.R. James, because you may think that I'm as much a stranger to that past as Freud was from femininity, but I took with C.L.R. James and Martin Luther King yesterday models of re-territorializing. James saying you take it away, take Du Bois away from just the intuition of the group, and Martin Luther King taking Gandhi away from our intuition and making of himself a Christian liberation theologist. How does dream work as allegory of reading accommodate and look forward to the readership of the future? Think back, if you will, to that formula I chanted: condensation, putting many meanings on one word like a metaphor; displacement, shifting it one notch to the next slot like a metonym; over-determination, undoing the condensation metaphor by way of a private grammar; and secondary revision, scrambling the previous steps so the dream keeps its secret and becomes readable at the same time. As I over-determine by way of undoing the condensations in reading, a future will look at how, in over-determining, I displace, that was Brigu's thing, in over-determining, I displace how my secondary revision hides my dream work. This latter bit is not a negative critique of what I'm doing, however. It is an acknowledgement of the necessity of the collective chain of interpretation as strictly historically necessary as well as strictly historically impossible. I don't offer the correct reading. Martha Nussbaum writes at one point that I'm giving the best theory. That is, I'm sorry to say, Professor Nussbaum is one of the smartest people in the academy, but that's a silly remark. You don't say I'm offering the best theory, no, because it's given over, otherwise laws could never be changed. So to an extent, this dream work reading, the secondary revision, etc., that is to the future. In earlier days, this used to be advanced as the distinction between history and philosophy, the most famous examples being Hegel's introduction to the science of logic and Marx's ever disarticulated articulation of originary accumulation, usually and misleadingly translated, quote, primitive accumulation, though the meaning has not been completely lost because of the empirical fact of colonial exploitation. This is where, I said yesterday, reading just the end, times, however, have changed. You don't need to hear that end. I am going to go straight on to lecture number 2. All right. That doesn't matter. I started at 4:20.
No, you got to
There we go. Principles, mere reason. But at any rate, okay, where were we yesterday? Yesterday, we ended with the remark that Dubois, when he was looking at China, right at the end, he felt that although there was a lot of praise, which we really found a little too much, nonetheless, he did say something which was completely on target, which was that in China, he saw that human nature was being changed. And I said that that is where, in fact, I want to begin. He is still talking about what he was looking for at the time of the general strike, and that is where I will begin today. Human nature, changing human nature, to make the world historical, speaking through the subaltern, into something that becomes the subaltern within the Freedmen's Bureau, the voice of the citizen. That's that change in human nature, okay? So, changing human nature so that it can be encountered by its world historical behavior. This is where we ended yesterday. It is an activization of Rosa Luxemburg's definition of spontaneity. World historical necessity offered and expressed on the register of individual collectivity. That is her definition of spontaneity. For Gramsci, the subaltern was outside of capital logic, and the logic of the modern state. The project of education was to produce the subaltern intellectual who would presumably become continuous with the world historical moment, the mainstream of international communism, and, of course, the Italian state. Now, this word continuous, I want you to mark it, because I'm going to show a few clips from Abdurrahman Sissako's film Bamako. And Lisha, you have already seen me do this, but you'll see how different this is. It's not the way, I can't find another film that actually shows this particular difference. So if I find one, I'll show it. But I keep on showing this one. The continuity, what Sissako is trying to show us is that the best of international civil society resistance, and the film was made right after the first World Social Forum, African World Social Forum in 2006 in Bamako, that the best international civil society resistance is continuous with, even if as they become culturalists, because you can only become a culturalist if you are indeed within the European Enlightenment. That's the good side of the European Enlightenment, which says, culturally, all cultures are wonderful and so on. When you're within a culture, it seems like human nature. It doesn't seem like it should be something celebrated. You celebrate it by living. That's the difference between culture as performative and culture as performance. But that's as it may be. So the point that Bamako is making, the film, that those those Africans who are continuous with good Africans, who are continuous with the best side, the black European, as Dubois says in his essay for Alan Locke, and the black European whom the white do-gooders don't like that much, says Dubois in that essay, right? But today, times having changed, what he's trying to point at is the difference between resistance and something called, quote, the people. So we'll keep that word continuous in our mind, okay? So for Gramsci, the subaltern was outside of capital logic and the logic of the modern state. The project of education was to produce the subaltern intellectual who would presumably become continuous with the world historical moment, the mainstream of international communism, and, of course, the Italian state. Situated in Europe, Gramsci moved us out of Europe by emphasizing the presence of the subaltern. By positing a general strike in 1861, Du Bois dreamed a world historical, not yet a personal, voice for the African, American, subaltern. No hyphens, only commas. How to bring the personal into the world historical after the death of that pocket of welfare statism, which is the Friedman's Bureau, by the American assumption, which is at work today around healthcare. How to bring the personal into the world historical after the death of that pocket of welfare statism was his issue. Situated in mainstream America, Du Bois moves us out of America, declaring the subalternity of the new African American subject by invoking the terms of the general strike. In the 1980s, South Asianist subalternists have taught us that we can only study the subaltern when subalternity brings itself into crisis. By thinking the general strike in 1935, it is this structure of bringing into crisis of a subalternity that Du Bois names. The reasonable logic of the dream work provides a way in by saying, what dream do they share? This is how far we had come yesterday. If Rosa Luxemburg's main experience of the general strike was the revolution of 1905, and if Du Bois's preparation for understanding how the subaltern speaks world historically was his stint as a village school teacher, Gramsci's major experience was the failed general strike in Turin. He was imprisoned shortly thereafter, but one lesson he had learned was the nature of the southern Italian urban proletariat and its relationship to party functionaries and its prejudice against the subalterns. And Du Bois, remember I read you that little note yesterday. There is another bit of note that I have brought here today where he says that, you know, his handwritten notes, and he says that a peaceful general strike of all the workers would bring the revolution in a week. And he says, but the biggest task of conversion is race prejudice. So to an extent, when Gramsci is talking about, Gramsci learns this during the failed strike and afterwards at Turin. Okay. A great deal, therefore, of what he pondered in jail was how to introduce parity in the proletariat party relationship and the relationship between the subaltern and the whole shebang. And, you know, I'll tell you something. All of those diagnoses of Du Bois, how wrong he was, etc., this is the problem that also Gramsci faces. The party functionaries and the theorists and the appropriate felicitous Marxists, they can't recognize what is going on here. You see, all they are interested in is saying, look at, I mean, I don't know if any of you have anything to do, you don't mind my ad-libbing, this means I'll never get these things read. If any of you will know anything about SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association, I think it's called. Every world, Women's World Bank, etc., they all, whenever you want, what is your example? They go to SEWA. They're not like SEWA at all. I mean, SEWA, she's rounded up 100,000 street workers, women, and said 10 rupees everyone. 10 rupees was a lot of money in the 50s. 10 rupees everyone next week or next month, I forget, and then we'll open a bank. Because she found out what the minimum amount was for opening a bank. So they opened, these illiterate women opened a bank on their own. That ain't exactly like the Women's World Banking, nor is it like microcredit and Yunus and stuff like that. At any rate, when she told me herself that when she wanted to do this in the 50s, and she was a Gandhian, all of this stuff, the union leaders told her, how are you going to do that? They don't have an employer. Because she was doing the BD workers and so on and so forth, unorganized, as we said. And so she found this brilliant lawyer she found this cash. She is actually, Ella Ben is very much alive, except she's gone too much toward Women's World Banking. But at any rate, she told me that she then devised this thing of self-employed women, etc. So that's the kind of thing that we are talking about, the subaltern and the difference between the party and the subaltern, etc. So therefore, this is what led him toward concentrating on the production of the subaltern intellectual. In Du Bois's words, the undoing of, and I quote, a want of self-confidence, self-assertiveness, a kind of spiritual hesitation in a world where spirit rules. This is Du Bois. Now this spiritual and spirit, these are important words. When he's talking about self-sufficiency, he's not talking about He's not talking about just economic self-sufficiency. No microcredit for Dubois. Okay, now here's the first departure. Okay, now, in Gramsci's, this is for me a token moment. In Gramsci's words, I quote, "Democracy cannot mean merely that an unskilled worker can become skilled. It must mean that every quote, citizen can, quote, govern, and that society places him, even if only abstractly, in a general condition to achieve this." This is a very different bag of beans from microcredit, okay? Yesterday we saw that C.L.R. James understood that Du Bois was attempting to recode slavery more broadly than its immediate and massive empirical outlines. In the education of the subaltern, Gramsci was trying to bring the subaltern into an intellectual parity with the European standard. In my talk today, I'll try to read these efforts comparatively, never forgetting dream logic. Not for me the endless speculation about hegemony, which is all you read. If you read a damn thing about Gramsci, it's nothing but hegemony. An important speculation, but that has to be understood in the context that it shares the contradictions inherent in the fact that all we have from Gramsci is cardboard notebooks full of notes to himself, except for the stuff that Ordina know over before he went to jail. But hegemony and so on, that's all we have, tiny little bit of writing. Each scholar who stabilizes Gramsci's views takes something away from the energy that saw each of these things, hegemony, the state, you name it, as medicine as well as poison. Young man in jail thinking and writing to himself. This is very, very different from making little principles that you can say. So Gramsci thinks this is hegemony and Du Bois thinks this is tarara. It's not like that. What we have in the prison notebooks is Gramsci thinking, not Gramsci publishing a book. Given his incarceration and his ill health, the activism in his thinking is amazing. And that is how each reader is invited to read him, not as a repository of concepts put in place by an associate with whom he had a stormy relationship and who was himself much more of a supporter of Stalin than Du Bois ever was, Palmiro Togliatti. That's the Gramsci we read, because the Togliatti's Gramsci, after Gramsci's death, was what was picked up by the English translators. So we have these little well-made essays and a book called Modern Prince. Gramsci never wrote those things. All we have from Gramsci is the quaderni, the little notebooks, right? Published, of course, now. But generally speaking, what the English readership of Gramsci, those prison notebook selections from, right? That's Togliatti. Togliatti's well-meaning yet possessive intervention is, once again, a case of undoing the dream into mere reasonableness. I have argued this in detail in the preface to my forthcoming book, and Lindsay isn't here. Lindsay, you're not here, are you? To my forthcoming book, An Aesthetic Education in an Era of Globalization, for Harvard University Press. But here I will be brief, since my chief concern is Du Bois. Before proceeding any further, I should also mention the brilliant work on Gramsci and Du Bois by my friend Ronald Judy. The first bit of it published is America and Powerless Potentialities. In this essay, Judy has presented an excellent analysis of Gramsci's views on Africa and the African American. My attempt here is on a simpler register that might at the same time be harder to grasp or accept, to see the texts of two lives as intertextual, to relate two dreams, and to keep their private provenance apart in the interest of offering a more inclusive, reasonable account from the one that a mere confidence in reasonableness as evidentiary syllogisms would produce. Let me remind you of some comments on textuality that I made yesterday. To some, they will be abundantly familiar. To others, however, given the fierce resistance to theory even in the highest places, I'm thinking, for example, of my dear friend Edward W. Said, who persisted to the end in turning a deaf ear to this argument. This may be difficult to receive hospitably. Open your imagination and let me repeat my words from yesterday. I'm speaking of the weave of, quote, experience, unquote, woven with reason on the weft, on the analogy of the senses, which is the Kantian intuition, an old Kantian intuition, that access to pure reason is on the analogy of the body. This is a very powerful, wonderful intuition. And in the warp, the threads which are extended lengthwise in the loom, usually twisted harder than the weft or woof, with which these threads are crossed to form the web or piece, as the OED says. I have metonymically named the warp the dream, but in fact it includes everything that produces our reasonableness, all the body-mind bits outside reason that common sense knows to count. That is where the word text comes from. Weave, in Latin texere, intertextuality in the textile, not just the verbal text. Why don't we give up on this smart word? Because our interests are the same as the other side. Remember the allegory of reading? Our interests are the same. We don't want to focus only on the verbal text. But, and further, we do not wish to trivialize life as brute fact and text as text when we want to justify a bad guy writing good stuff, even as we inevitably think of life producing thought. We inevitably think that. We think life produces thought. But when we justify a bit of text and say, you know, the guy was just sorry, you know, historical problem was a screwball, but see, so in fact, it happens this way. I don't want this to be, we don't want this to be hidden. So that's why we don't give up on that old word. Let us then consider briefly how the textuality of their lives, the abstract threads that make up the web and produces the dream of reason, can be seen together. How, over determining, I can perhaps make them intertextual, with singularity, which is what is universalizable, differentiated from difference. Simply and briefly, a hard task. You see, this is truly boring for people who are like hardcore Marxists who really wanted to know about, you know, all the kind of topics that Gramsci touches, etc. I mean, I could do it for a small fee, but it's not really a useful thing to do. What was it? I don't believe Dubois and Gramsci were aware of each other's work, although given Dubois's voracious reading habits, I cannot be sure. I have actually looked at the printout of all the books in his library in Accra. And so I would have to go in more carefully into some of the titles. Maybe there is some Gramsci in there, who knows, but that's right at the end of his life. Fisk, I saw the Fisk list also, yeah. So, and also, you know, the ones that are available otherwise. No, that's the last thing I looked at, and that's that fact. What was it like to be a physically deformed, Gramsci was a hunchback, probably with untreated spinal tuberculosis, with the magnificent head that we are acquainted with, smart lad, in a troubled, his father was imprisoned, family in Sardinia at the turn of the last century. We all want to see Gramsci as completely transparent, just a Marxist theorist. It is only us who always talk about, you know, everybody, I'm wearing a sari, you're looking fabulous. And African Americans are talking about Africa, culturalism. But of course, these are Europeans. They don't have lives. So here is D.H. Lawrence in his much praised Sea and Sardinia. I quote, I love my indomitable coarse men from mountain Sardinia for their stocking caps and their splendid animal bright stupidity. End of quote. Expressing a fairly representative sentiment for the times. Gramsci was critical of the fact that those who, like the talented 10th, and also because of class privileges, broke into the general scene, moved into northern Italy and became indistinguishable from the north. This is the first connection. Du Bois, as the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard, and as he explained before he went south, he didn't know much about this kind of racist thing. Du Bois did not have to focus on the specific identity of the Negro, which, as he makes clear in his own writings, was not part of his youthful self-representation. So this connects Gramsci and Du Bois. Gramsci and Du Bois neither of them actually had to come back in this way so we could celebrate them. And the difference, for Luxemburg, capitalism had already happened. For Gramsci's Sardinia, the European standard could be a distant goal. Du Bois, in his daring, had to posit a world historical subject for the black subaltern, almost coeval with the working life of Karl Marx, 1860 to 1880. That also, keep that in mind. But the overarching intertextuality for both, the way they thought, the general strike needed thinking education into citizenship. A bit of a high-Tory understanding of the agency of social change, the more cynical David Levering Lewis would say. This is, again, in that unpublished lecture given in Germany. That's what he says Du Bois shares with the Europeans. Those are the two heads I will touch today and finish with a few film clips. In the famous passage from the Black Reconstruction that I quoted yesterday, Du Bois writes, what the Negro did was to wait, look and listen, and try to see where his interest lay. Here is the first term of the general strike, a subaltern and proletarian subject of collective action acting in justified self-interest. The ideologue can only give tactical advice, says Rosa Luxemburg, not strategic, certainly not theoretical. For her experience of the great general strike of 1905 in the Russian Empire seemed to offer her an agent who was already prepared by economic circumstances. Their spontaneity was world historical for her. For Du Bois, as for Gramsci, the ideologue must self-instrumentalize so that from self-interest, see where his interest lay, however justified. The subaltern can be moved to communicating with the stars, and I quote, it would not do to concentre all effort on economic well-being and forget freedom and manhood and equality. Rather, Negroes must live and eat and strive and still hold unfaltering commerce with the stars. This is Du Bois, right? So the thing is, there is, of course, with the people I work, you know, the guy called Nimai Lohar, right? Illiterate, totally illiterate. The others have had a little something. He retains some stuff that, in fact, the ones who have had a little schooling have lost. This is a fact that, you know, and especially if one thinks of orality not as enforced illiteracy, but real orality with those incredible computer-like genealogical memories, sure, there is something you lose. That's also a double mind. But at the same time, rather than just kind of work on with that kind of primitivism, whereas we want something else for our children, this is the problem that you have to confront. You know, if I were a disciplinary anthropologist of like a minor sort, then I would sit down with this illiterate guy and do my kind of treasure trove of whatchamacallit. Whereas now he's just one of my co-workers. I sang a song that I heard from him at a lecture that Lisha was at, also in Turkey, in order to, just a line, in order to say how world literature, that attempt fails. That's his song, okay? Now, what I really was saying was that Nimai sings this by rote. It is cultural conformity that he's showing. You know, so that he has told me, oh, sister called, didn't she, because she wanted the words after I had sung it to her, etc. But Nimai can't. Maybe he can produce the interpretation in a way that I'm not catching, but he cannot transcode it that way. So I don't think we can really practice the bad faith of wanting to keep the primitive in its primitive place because it is stronger than the literacy and the civilization that we ourselves share. So to an extent, for Du Bois and for Gramsci, the ideologue must self-instrumentalize, and to see how Gramsci articulates this, we will first look at Gramsci's life web. Here suffice it to say that because of the circumstances in which they encountered or named a general strike, they were not far from young Marx's hope that every individual might be singularized into an example of species being. This is the notes when he's 26, right? Economic and Philosophical, which is supposed to be before the epistemological cut. But this is the hope for socialism, that every individual is going to be an example of species being. Singularity, universalizable. This is the dream that connects these people. The details of Antonio Gramsci's life are well known. He was born in 1891, 20-odd years younger than Du Bois, 1868, and Rosa Luxemburg, 1871. He went to the University of Turin to study philology, which at the time was the foundation of the humanities. His professors felt that it was a great loss when he left to become a practicing communist, and from within communism, he became the head of the party. He questioned mechanical Marxism. This was an unbelievable act of courage and intelligence at that point, and tried to think about education not just as party formation, not even human capital, as people say today, but the building of citizenship. In 1926, he was jailed, as we know, after a mockery of a trial where his parliamentary immunity, he was an elected official of the state by then, was not recognized. And the words of the public prosecutor or the judge, perhaps apocryphal, have been memorialized. I'm saying all this because you said yesterday there were people in the audience who hadn't read the Black Reconstruction. So I thought I might as well say this also. What were those words? We must stop this brain working for 20 years. He did not last 20 years. He died in April 1937. He was sick all through, and prison life killed him. But Mussolini's punishment did not succeed. Gramsci thought for the philosophers of the future, who have, alla Togliatti, turned him into something else. He filled 29 notebooks. Thus, at the end of their lives, both of them suffered, supposedly because the state was acting in defense of the state. And I quote what was said about Du Bois's stuff. But whereas it is easy for us to dismiss Mussolini's Italy as fascist and therefore wrong, the general readership cannot quite dismiss the United States like that in spite of McCarthy and all that stuff. Du Bois blotted his copybook with his Stalin and with his this and with his that. And because of Du Bois's unqualified admiration for communism. Yet, from the point of view of the agents woven into this web, we might want to mark intertextuality. And people say, is this important? Like Effie said in that class. I don't know if anybody else is here from that class. You know, Gayatri, you give too much form and not enough content. Content with this kind of information commanded. Google it, you'll find everything. I'm not Google or a substitute for Google. So thus, at the end of their lives, both of them suffered, supposedly because the state was acting in its own defense, and so on and so forth. From the point of view of the agents woven into this web, we might want to mark intertextuality. Gramsci, young and sick, thrown in jail by the state. Du Bois, old and therefore necessarily infirm, welcomed out of the country by the state. Du Bois was supported by a loving and militant wife in a wonderful example of criticism that takes into account the textuality of lives. Teresa de Lauretis commented in 1976 on the women who held up Gramsci. In 1995, the letters from Giulia Gramsci, the wife of Antonio, were published in German. And then in 2009, those from Tatiana Schucht, her sister, to whose persistent labors we owe the notebooks, were published, also in German. They have now been published in Italian, big collection by Einaudi. We will turn to Teresa de Lauretis' words tomorrow. You know, there's Mary Shelley, Dorothy Wordsworth, some names we know. But we'll turn to that tomorrow. It is hard to keep the two looms together as they unweave and weave the two lives for us. Yet it is within that movement that we have to place the two sets of speculations. Although so much younger and with a lifespan so short that one may say that it was embedded in Du Bois's, Gramsci had a greater intimacy with the communist machine. He was leader of the Communist Party in a small but crucial European state which took its place among the felicitous parties, aspiring at least to the enlightened status of the party as modern prince. Although not connected in this way, Du Bois was much more in the world through direct and initiating involvement with Pan-Africanism through the international anti-colonial struggles. Yet, in the House of International Communism, he was never more than an honored guest, always being shown the best face. Gramsci knew the dirt. He talked Marxism with his friends in groups, keeping track of the strikes, busy establishing what would today be called non-governmental organizations. The final application to join the party, Communist Party, not very much more than a valedictory gesture to the state, to the inhospitable state of his birth. Communism was everything to Gramsci. For Du Bois, it came to be a bedrock. Within these two discontinuous webs, we look at Gramsci, critical of Rosa Luxemburg's influential theory of the mass strike. And he says that it was too economistic, that economic circumstances do not necessarily produce the collective mindset that could organize a general strike. Marx's project, he says, had been to make the worker know the economic and its politics. Gramsci saw in this an epistemological burden. Okay, I think I should end here today because I've spoken 50 minutes and a little more because Skip wanted me to go a little more. And I'll tell you why. Because yes, I have a bigger house today than yesterday, but more people left. You know why? Because that's not how we talk about Gramsci. And I think some people had wanted also, because, you know, I've been around, some people also wanted me to have Gramscian concepts and Du Boisian concepts and say, here is similarity and here is difference. That's how my friend Perry Anderson does his. It's like an Oxford paper, a tutorial paper. plus, and then the minuses, and then a conclusion. I want to be sober like Perry, but I'm too old to really kind of redo that. I'm trying something a little different, and it seems like this is a kind of chatty old woman's way of speaking about Gramsci and Dubois. There is more coming, okay? But I would also say that unless one is able to think about these people and the age in this way, as I say to my students, transform those dates into something like your birthday so that you will never forget them. It's not a footnote logic. Unless one is able to think this way, you cannot think comparatively. Otherwise, I've even seen stuff that says, Gramsci was only a white man. Are you joking or what? What is it? What is white? So it's an incomprehensible thing. I've actually seen this thing. So therefore, you will forgive me for daring to bring that which literary criticism brings to us. We talk about heroes in ways that are comparable to the way in which I'm talking about Dubois and Gramsci. So that you see this young, sick man who lived only 46 years, and this grand guy, very proud of his own masculinity, who lived 95 years. You can see how in the web of history, which is much longer than human lives, they can be counted together. It's very hard to think of them together. And that's what I am. Perhaps I'm failing in doing that, but nonetheless, that's what I'm trying to do. Think them together, rather than make lists and say, Gramsci was this and Du Bois was that. That's not what I'm doing. As I say, if I had to take an exam, since I know that most teachers examine this way, I'd be able to do that. You'll have to take it on trust, okay? So what I'm going to do now then is just make an end. Tomorrow, I'm going to read some of the similarities and differences within this context, and then I'm going to look at Bamako, some clips, Bamako. And then tomorrow, I will read Souls of Black Folk, which is what most people know Du Bois to have written. Even O.J. Simpson's lawyer said O.J. was suffering from double consciousness. Now, the thing is that it's true on TV. So the thing is that Du Bois moved, I mean, the double consciousness is, of course, a fact. It's a fact. But the doubleness of consciousness is not it's not the property of the African American in all classes. Double consciousness is a much more complicated thing than what Du Bois, in his, more or less his first book, although it wasn't really his first book, what Du Bois was talking about. And he moved. He moved. Just as old Derrida moved away from what Jameson, I love him, he's a wonderful guy, but he inevitably pronounces what Derrida was talking about in the Grammaire, l'écriture. But Derrida certainly moved away from l'écriture. You never hear him talking about that. Nobody laughed at this pronunciation of the French word l'écriture. You know, l'écriture. Anyway, so, you know, but at any rate, so he moved away, right? So in that sense, tomorrow I'm going to read Souls of Black Folk, not from the point of view of the souls of black folk, but I'm going to read it in the way that I have prepared myself, you know, this kind of dreaming logic, this kind of allegory of reading, what's happening in the book rather than, because after all what happens in the book is prose, what's happening in the book rather than O.J. Simpson's lawyer's reading. Everybody suffering from double consciousness. So, and then I'm going to wait. There's much more I'll do tomorrow. Tomorrow you won't be here, man, so I'll go until 6 o'clock. Nobody will be able to ask questions because Daddy won't be here to say. But you remember you said yesterday, we want to talk too. And then I thought to myself, yeah, I'm going to stop when he says no, go on. See? So therefore, tomorrow after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Tilly Olson's Tell Me a Riddle. Because Tilly Olson's major experience is that 1905, whatchamacallit. And Du Bois in his lectures, early lectures, 1906, at Hampton, the smug Hampton as he called it, he talks about the riddle. He talks about the riddle that he's giving to his basically male, although they're kind of honorary male females, these women, men and women. And so I'm going to put that riddle that Du Bois locates and the riddle that Tilly Olsen asks the reader to tell them, and finish the feminist stuff, maybe just a little look at Darkwater, just a very little look at the violence, that piece, all tied together. And tomorrow I probably will go a little longer than 50 minutes. Bring your bottles of water, but I won't go beyond 5:45, okay? Because I wanna finish, okay? So if you want a little break in the middle, I can even do that tomorrow, yeah? And then, because it's not correct if I see, I don't believe in the immortality of the soul. That's how you are like an atheist in Hinduism. In a polytheist thing, you can't be an atheist. So what God don't you believe in? So what happens is you don't believe in Atman. That's what you don't believe in. Okay, so therefore, on the other hand, superstition dies hard, right? So if I don't get to finish and I die, I'll have to come back. It's a very ecological theory of rebirth, right? There are only so many souls, and they go around. You know, everybody will not be resurrected in heaven. It goes around, okay? So another baby is born, another soul is used up. I'll have to come back like a stone or a dog or, you know, or something like that. So tomorrow I'll go to the end, okay? But like that, but maybe a break in the middle, but certainly not beyond 5:45. Now it would be great if I could hear some questions. Thank you.
Good questions. Comments. Gayatri, that was spectacular. You need to love.
It was what it was, Kip.
It was great, babe. Talk to you tomorrow.
Okay.
See you later.
Okay, great. We have 2 microphones available, so Gayatri, I'll let you select whoever you want, but please wait for the microphone, so that's going to be captured on the video.
Yeah, somebody else should recognize because I can't see a hand. Yes. By the way, you know, Bamako will be shown tomorrow. So, Nick, we have to find someone, right, to show the clips. Yeah.
Thank you. My question has to do with, yesterday you mentioned Paulo Freire while you were talking about the connection between Gramsci and Dubois and the way they saw... Dubois. And the way, sorry. Dubois and the way they saw the intellectual. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more there, how you dream them together in seeing the intellectual and their role in this quest for education. Also you being a person who has dreamed about education and working as an activist.
I think that it would be, I mean, I mentioned Freire, and all people can be, you remember that there are some people who are our age in the audience. You remember Kurt Vonnegut's wonderful refrain, nice, nice, very nice, cat's cradle. So many different people in the same device. See, so you can in fact put all kinds of people in the same device. But but all arguments are not identical. So in the argument that, like I said, I'm not just talking about dream. I'm talking about dream as managing reason. The reasonable approach would be to make those 2 lines. Gramsci thought hegemony was this. Gramsci thought the state was this. Du Bois thought this was that and this was that. That's what it would be. So, but I'm not unreasonable. So therefore, I would say that the Freire does not enter into my argument too much. The Freire is in a position where he is actually conscientizing the people in terms of, I mean, the Latin American context is very different. He is actually training up the people in order for them to see what it is that they ought to be doing. And then Freire works out of it, not through his own problems, because he's also not welcomed in the state, as these people aren't, into the World Council of Churches, into Geneva, into a situation which begins to lose its outline with today's international civil society. So in that context, Freire is not within this Marxist notion of, although of course the guerrilla situation in Latin America when he begins is very much comparable. It seems to me that the way in which Gramsci and Du Bois can be put together, it's not because this is also true that the Latin American situation that allowed for a Freire to happen is a situation where even earlier, Althuserian structuralist Marxism freed them from the party line. Now, neither Du Bois nor Gramsci is in that conjuncture. Neither of them is in the conjuncture of having escaped the party line, which is why this whole relationship with the party and this whole debate about was it correct to say proletarian dictatorship, was it right to say general strike, and so on. So therefore, I would say that although Paulo Freire, I used his name because I gave an example that he did say very correctly that without the pedagogy of the oppressed become sub-oppressors. A man who really did work with them says this, and it carries more authority than anything I would say would. That's why. But as for myself, I don't really, I'll tell you, I don't go there with any kind of a book in mind. Okay? I've never written anything about it, and the 26 years, that's a long time, and I publish a good deal. I've never written anything. There was one little thing in that Writing Wrongs because I had just come back from there, and I was speaking in Britain because I have to get the money to buy the tickets since these schools are all run on my own money. So therefore, I always have to give a talk right when I'm returning, and that's always a very devastating kind of experience. And so I was standing there, I didn't know what to say as I saw all these kind of my own kind, Indian British, valorizing themselves, saying, oh, they're suffering madly away. Then I had really come from this place where they didn't even know that their wretchedness was not normal. So I tried to bring in some stuff from them that I had learned about the nation, etc. And I used to then travel with the women. These are the schools that were shut down, and sing with them, right? The oral formulaic. And so I used some of that oral formulaic stuff to talk about nation and so on. And so obviously, you know, Gayatri Spivak singing, immediately they just loved this so much, like my wearing a sari, that I would never get an invitation from Amnesty International because I talk in this boring way. I mean, if I were an artist, it would happen. But, you know, I could be Alfredo Yar. But, you know, an intellectual who talks like this, who the hell would invite her for Amnesty International? No. So, but because of this, they saw that, you know, I was singing, I knew them. I got an invitation to Amnesty International, and I had to put that in. And as for the reason why both of my introducers have talked about this effort, it was, as I said yesterday, because Michaela said, the bio you have sent is not long enough. So I said to my research assistant, how can we make this bio long? So we sat down together, and she said, Gayatri, put this in, because she knows I go to these places and I do these things, right? And so that's how it got put in. So I don't go there thinking of any books, because if you're thinking of any books, be it Du Bois, Gramsci, I don't care, God's book, you're not going to be able to learn anything from the mistakes you're making with these people cognitively damaged over thousands of years. So it so happened, I've been teaching Gramsci since the late 70s. Du Bois since 91. I never thought about these things, and there was any connection or anything. But then, after this experience in the boonies had matured for 26 years, I began to teach Gramsci again in a seminar, and I said, my God, look at this guy. What it has learned, it has taken me that long to think of, making mistake after mistake. This young man sitting in a jail can think this. That's the power of the imagination. And that's why, you know, like card-carrying Marxists leave in droves when I talk about Gramsci in this way. So it was like a feeling of comradeship afterwards. I don't think of Gramsci when I'm there. It's not possible. I'm sorry Ben Baer is not here, because he's a white British guy who's learned Bengali, who goes with me, right? And he would kind of laugh in the back of the room, right? It's not possible. If you think, you can't. I mean, when you're plunged into those classrooms, there is no way that you can think of anything but what the hell to do with human beings who, you know, these are human children, and look what's been done to them. You don't go there thinking about theories. Absolutely not. But what happens is, theory happens. And you also see that what in the theories is resisted. So the goal in the theory kind of emerges. And that's what also brought me to this business in Du Bois. I could see that what was really important was that Du Bois was speaking, as people hadn't noticed, of the African subaltern, you know, and that's why I began to see the these two people together. I did not go in there thinking about anything, and I don't go in there thinking about anything now. We eat in this little Chinese restaurant in Calcutta, Ben and I, when we come back. It's called Chinese Pavilion. It's on Old Ballygunge Road, in the corner of Bondell Road. Adore Calcutta Chinese. They've been there since 18th century, right? They're like Bengalis, Chinese Bengalis. But the food is different from any Chinese food anywhere else in the world, okay? So we sit there and we talk. And then we talk about Derrida and Marx and Dubois and Gramsci and you name it, okay? Because he is a PhD, teaches at Princeton, and I'm what I am. That's very different. But this never gets into writing because we're not doing ethnography. So that's the connection there. Sorry, it's a long answer, but okay.
So both yesterday and today, I was intrigued by, you used the term cognitively damaged rural subaltern. So how do you measure this cognitive damage, and can you say more about the source and how to fix it? Because
I can.
I'm from Haiti, so where we have lots of illiterate compatriots,
Okay.
and I've been doing some work in linguistics with the language and how they learn, and so I'm just very curious about this phrase and how do you measure it?
Wonderful question, wonderful question. Let me begin by saying I don't know. That's the real answer. But it merits more, merits more. You see, now I'm talking about thousands of years, do you understand? Leila, are you leaving? You're coming back, okay. Golden Grove, what? But whatever, see, I'm talking about thousands of years of withdrawal from intellectual labor. Colonialism is young. I'm talking about the oppression of the so-called Indian aboriginals. It's thousands of years. As they are getting pushed back, these are not, there are at last count 72 million aboriginals in India. When I went to South Africa in 1991 at the invitation of the ANC, I wanted to, this is a dirty secret, I wanted to talk about them. Nobody was interested. They were all interested in Mahatma Gandhi. But so these folks, as they're pushed back in the South, a little bit better for historical reasons that I'm not going to go into now. But now these people, as well as the lowest castes of Hinduism, these are of course animists, right? What they were really denied was the right to intellectual labor because they were used only for manual labor. So even if there were intellectual labor, they were kind of punished. And this goes on, okay? So therefore, what happens is the analytical skills are ruined. So that, and very early on, they're not born like that, but very early on, because of course they're entering the unorganized, looking after goats or domestic labor and so on and so forth, like age 3, 4. In my schools, I ask them to come in, I feed them in the middle of the day, I ask them to, but they're very colonial. I ask them to bring them in even when they can write or anything so that they begin to love it. They just have a slate and a pencil and they go like this and go like this, and maybe at some point suddenly a letter emerges. But that's not enough. So at any rate, what happens is my sister died, my older sister died, because she had a peculiar kind of Alzheimer's, so that she began to forget things like how to eat, so that she choked to death. She didn't know that you had to, she was a physics professor, that you had to chew and you had to swallow, and so she died. When I look at these children, I feel that that's what has happened to the understanding, because we have oppressed them and denied the possibility of using their minds for thousands of years. No intellectual labor. So you will see, I'll give you an example, and you'll see. And they look enraged because they know they should be. I used to be a singer, okay? I can't sing anymore, classical singer with a degree. But I can imagine what my voice could do. I can't do that anymore, right? You can see in the eyes of these children a kind of rage that they know they should be able to do it. It's gone. A little older, they know. Okay, like this. We have diacritical marks in my native language, okay, like A, E, right, like that. So I'm saying, okay, you add to K, A becomes Ka. You add to K, A becomes Ka. You add to G, A becomes Ga. You add to M, A becomes Ma. Now let's add to pa. 5 minutes. I'm looking at my watch. I won't say anything. Time goes. See, this is not a very hard thing. Not one person, not even someone who was oh, teacher, I found it. You feel like killing yourself. This is why and this is just one example. Most of them, the teachers, think that the decimal system is some kind of absurdity. Remember, India invented the decimal system. That the decimal system is some kind of absurdity visited upon the rural poor by the ruling classes, like all the absurdities that they visit. When I start teaching the decimal system, people come, I say, that's the humanities education, the poetry of the decimal system. And, people are standing all around saying, my God. And half of them are not understanding anything because, this is all wrong. That's what I meant. It's a damage because intellectual labor, mind you, the metaphor works there, this nimai. I have said, and this is in a piece, in that Writing Wrongs piece, right? Matha khatano. Matha khatano, making the head work, khatano, like speculating on the market, it's called khatano, taka khatano, money, okay? And gotor khatano. So I use the metaphor. I say, you look at all your masters, you know what they're doing? They're sitting at home, matha khatache, and you are outside, gotor khatacho. You see, this is what you have to learn. So it's been 25 years, so things are moving a little. But nonetheless, that's what I meant, cognitively damaged. Go ahead.
So for comparison, so when I think of, say, Haiti, which I know much better than India, so if you look at slavery there, so it was pretty much like you described, where we had a group of people that was excluded from any intellectual endeavors.
Of course.
But yet they've produced some amazing cultural feats, including voodoo, the arts, and the painting. So So I'm having trouble relating what you're describing about this class in India versus what I've known about the Haitian subalterns. You see, and also about your point about literacy, we also have a huge illiteracy issue there, and there's been very successful efforts in teaching adults how to read, which never before were exposed to literacy. So I'm trying to see what makes...
Learning to read is not an unquestioned good. And also, I'm not fighting with you.
No,
if you can't think about it, I can only say, come with me. Haiti and India are not comparable. There are details which perhaps would show you why this massive civilization of 1 billion people and at least 7,000 to 8,000 years, that's a long, long time and a lot of people. So the difference, today within globalized capital, we constantly talk about the exacerbating difference between the rich and the poor. If you think about the exacerbating difference between the producers of that kind of extraordinary Sanskrit poetry, my Brahminical ancestors, and the way, it's not like they had nothing. They have incredible herbal medicine, for example. Their ability to, that's what I was saying when Skip was sitting there. We can't be just primitivists with them. I'm in a double bind there. The herbal medicine stuff, as you well know, it's in the United States is itself not very clean here. That's getting patented all over the place, right? When these people don't even know a damn thing about patenting, you try to tell them, it becomes like the indigenous knowledge stuff in South Africa. The only thing that you're doing is saying you must be adequately compensated. That is like putting Dubois on one side and Gramsci on one side and comparing subjects, all right? They're very good at making weather predictions. It's almost unbelievable the way they can look at this. So I'm not saying that they are unable to do things. You see, this is how, why would I say that? 25 years of my life wasted there. I got TB there. I got everything there. I have bronchiectasis, coughing all the time. My body is inscribed because I go there. Why would I tell a lie? These people, the people in Indiana, they thought I was saying they're dumb. I'm not saying they're dumb. I'm saying that we have not made it possible. All these pictures of literacy, do we stop with just teaching reading, writing, and numeracy to our children? See, how to manage the phenomenal world is what I'm talking about. And this is not given, and as India and China are rising like rockets, the bottom's falling off. I go to mud schools in China year after year. And so one can talk a great deal about it. I'm very glad that Haiti has produced art and voodoo and so on. So have these people. So have these people. But that's what I was talking about in terms of the performative and performance. This is, I wrote about this in a critique of post-colonial reason, the West Australian Aborigines, when they see, this is why people superficially, she's a racist. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I have my standards are the same at Columbia and there. So therefore, what happens is, the West Australian Aborigines, when they said that we have lost our language, they didn't mean that they didn't know how to speak the Walpiris. What they meant was that that was no longer their performative. That was not the software with which they were living, right? And so what they demanded, and this was smart as smart could be, they wanted that to be part of the curriculum, performance, part of exhibitions. But the Indian subalterns, that would not be much of anything. Why? Because at the top, that kind of subaltern, Tagore is from that area. So we all know about that kind of subaltern stuff being put into performance and so on and so forth. Primitivism in India is old. So therefore, I would say that what I'm talking about, I cannot prove. As I said, I don't know how it can be undone. It probably won't be in my lifetime. And I can't get people interested in, the state. I want the state to use my skills to train. I have policies in my head as to how primary school teachers should be trained. But this is not something where generalizations can be made about how they have done many things, and I'm not looking at that. No, I'm applying to them the standards that I apply to tertiary education at one of the world's most elite universities, and by that, all I see is the crime of history, and I do not know how to solve it, probably not in my lifetime. Again, a very long answer. It has nothing to do with Dubois. That's the problem. See, yesterday, remember I said, just mention Dubois and then go into other things. I don't want to talk about myself. Let's go into Dubois if we still have time.
Not exactly about Du Bois, but about his antagonist, Marcus Garvey, who was around the 1990, well, let's see, 1919 and 1925 was the height of his movement. And I was wondering if you
Du Bois a white nigger.
Yes, he did. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious as to what bringing Marcus Garvey into the conversation, what directions it may lead us. One thing that comes to mind is that Du Bois was somewhat removed from the ordinary folk, or at least that was Garvey's accusation. And Garvey's movement was huge. I mean, they had chapters in Latin America, they had chapters in Africa. It was this huge sort of people-generated movement. So I'm just wondering if how Garvey might inform your effort to bring. Or
I like Marcus Garvey, because you are a Marcus Garvey supporter. You like Marcus Garvey?
I favor Marcus Garvey.
Good,
yes.
Good. See, I tell you, my feeling, and you correct me here, my feeling is that Garvey, I wouldn't use that phrase, although in a very drunken way, and I will not name, I used to drink a lot. I gave up in '89. In a very drunken way, I called one of my African-American friends that very name. I won't say who, but I have never lived down that shame. But anyway, Marcus Garvey is to an extent correct. That's not the point. The point is the reason why Garvey could have such a huge movement was because apart from all of the stuff that people have documented, that he was, all his so-called crimes, apart from that, he was a serious and sincere man. But he was not a counterintuitive person. Counterintuitive people who are against the general intuition of the crowd, that wasn't just because Du Bois was white identified. It was because Du Bois was unlike also the white folks who were thinking in a very nice way like this. So to an extent, I was telling somebody, and this is published stuff, I wrote a little piece for a collection edited by Judith Butler and Kendall Thomas about Marx. And I have pictures there, which I take from really Mega, the wonderful edition of Marx that was coming out of the Soviet Union when it existed. And so I was showing that Marx would write something that was counterintuitive. And Engels, who adored him and loved him, would make an explanation, because of course counterintuitive stuff is hard. The explanation was exactly wrong. Then Marx, and I have pictures, and Marx loved his dear Fred, and he probably wasn't like figuring it out either. I mean, what was he, lazy guy, drank and kind of, you know, slept with his maid and so on and so forth, occasionally went to the British Council and British Museum and got extremely cross with the Gotha program because they didn't do exactly what he had asked them to do. But at any rate, he would put it in the footnote. Next edition, Engels would put it in the text. And if you look at this whole thing of the romantic American Marxism, use, value, etc., it's the Engels passages, not the Marx passages, because Marx is so counterintuitive. It will take a long time. Again, if you look at all of this of Lukács reification, etc., it's the Engelsian insight, not Marxian. So therefore, I think that's the real difference between Garvey and Du Bois. The counterintuitive ones either don't have followings, or they have followings that exactly do not, who transform whatever is counterintuitive into this huge kind of other things, so that you know, there is a following, but if you go look at the text, you'll see that this is not, I mean this, well, I don't want to go there because I'm a little scared of saying this, but so that's my feeling about him. I like Marcus Garvey. I think the kind of flamboyant, really bringing together kind of person that he was, we have need of those as well. But I think in the long run, in the historical long run, it's the counterintuitive ones who are opened up again and again by people, rethought and redone. I don't think Garvey will be dealt with like that. Who? Garvey or Du Bois? Well, the thing is, revolution is a very heavily, I see where you're going. You can say that it's revolutionary, but revolution is a charged word, right? Counterintuitive simply means unlike our common sense. Really, that's all. I mean, revolution, it's, I mean, overthrowing or changing state formation by armed struggle. This ultimately leaves people, if it is for people, you can say what you like, the so-called revolutionaries, about how people really have changed and so on and so forth. But in fact, taking care of epistemological change in people is rather different. I should know, I come from one of the great, not revolutions, but bloodless national liberations, don't I? And I was born in British India. So, but then the idea, and I have heard this also from Bangladeshi activists, very close friends of mine, Shondara I'm thinking of, who wonderful woman who joined, and then she said, you know, Gayatri, we thought that once independence came in, everything would be okay, and so then I could pursue my studies, because she gave it up, right? She said, but everything went wrong. You see, so that's the whole thing, you know, practice of freedom rather than liberation, freedom to rather than freedom from. You see, that stuff is counterintuitive, because although everybody like us can go for freedom from oppression, etc., join together, sing, etc., but that stuff is boring, the other stuff hard, and you're obliged to say, I don't know what will make the change, which is why I don't write grant proposals, because their idea of evaluation, I find them disgusting. I won't have them come in and evaluate this damn thing where you know, we're trying to do something which, how dare they say that they can evaluate? There will be no success. There will be no success. So to that extent, you know, it's like, it's two different kinds of work. You see what I'm trying to say? But we need, long live the Marcus Garveys of the world. We need them. They're not for me. You know, Mao changed. Mao became Marcus Garvey-like when he did his Cultural Revolution. He was like a split man. When he was, so you know what I'm saying? There's both in some people. But it's nice to see a Garvey person. I mean, that moment.
Yeah, quickly to my mind, though, what came to mind was what Marcus Garvey did that, to my mind, was counterintuitive, was transform how black people thought about themselves. And he flipped, these categories.
See, yes, but let's not use the word counterintuitive too easily. Remember when I was talking about counterfocalizing with that Kutsia thing? Noah, you were in that class. Everybody saw counterfocalizing in everything, okay? So, no, I mean, if you can change the mind of a huge group of people into this kind of grand overturning, that also happens. And that's a wonderful thing. In fact, Marxism on the whole did it for a time to the working class. Not today. Today it's just job security, but, and make jobs and so on and so forth. But it did happen. So what we are talking about here, and I'm very glad you're bringing up these questions, are different kinds of social and intellectual engagement. But not all of them is what I am calling against the common sense of the people. Because overturning bad common sense, where a woman thinks, like my unique fulfillment is if I breed, and my unique fulfillment is in one person, one male, and so on and so forth, that can be overturned because that's not intuitive. Because the first one is also a long-standing kind of bogus stuff, right? So you don't know how to undo these things. You know what I mean? I can't tell you this one is a good one, that one is a bad one. I would be wrong. See, that's why I was saying anybody who says, yes, I really know what this means, is wrong. But that's why Engels put all of the things that Marx wrote that were not like Capital Volume 1, he was dead by then, into Capital Volume 3. You read Volume 2, I'm like, God, is this Marx? So to an extent, it seems to me that that's a very important point you've brought up. And if I was giving that impression that counterintuitive means changing a whole group of people's self-concept and making it good, strong, then I was wrong, and I needed to answer your question. But you see what I'm saying? And we probably should have a much longer conversation, especially about Marcus Garvey at some point, because I really am fascinated by that guy.
At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned the dream as allegory for reading and talked about the metaphorical and the conceptual. And as someone not as well versed in these conversations, I was hoping you could explain what you mean by metaphorical and conceptual and what's the implication of them not being equivalent.
Who's going to tell me what the metaphorical is? I mean, at the end of the day, I find it hard to describe what the metaphorical is. Does someone want to say what the metaphorical is? You can't not know what the metaphorical is. Can you not? Do you not know? Can we hear it for the metaphor?
In this particular context, I'm curious
Tell
to
me
hear
what the metaphorical is, then I'll tell you what the conceptual is. What, in your view, is the metaphorical? I mean, it's a word in the English language. What do you say? I mean, it's your native language, not mine. So, what do you mean when you use that word?
I feel really on the spot. I'm not sure.
You feel on the spot, okay. Metaphor is when you compare two different things that are not similar and bring up some charge. On the other hand, you know how to read them. If someone says, my love is a red rose, you know that that doesn't mean that your love has many, 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 many petals and red in color and smells good, right? So something happens there that you can call it imagination. You can. On the other hand, the concept is the reasonable thing. People say, well, this is not reasonable. If you say, my love is a red rose, obviously my love is not a red rose. I mean, my freshman composition people quite often would make a list of the lies in the text. My love is not a red rose. So the metaphor is a lie, which in turn with the imagination gives a kind of idea. But it is a lie according to an idea of truth. That's the concept. So people would say, my love is a red rose is a metaphor. My love is full of such goodness that he gives me the same pleasure as looking at a rare red rose, and he gives me the same sensual pleasure as smelling the smell of a rose. That would be conceptual language, the metaphor broken up. So what I was saying was, and this is not my perception, many people have thought this, is that without the idea concept that there are metaphors, the metaphor wouldn't work. And without recognizing that even in the word concept, which is, conceiving, those of you who have had children here know very well that, conceiving is not just conceptual. So therefore, without the metaphor in those words, concept has that one. In German, there's Begriff, grasping, right? So without those metaphors, you cannot have your logic working. So the two of them are completely Bois. This is far from Du Bois and Gramsci, but they are intermingled in that way. That's what I was saying. Okay, number one. Number two, allegory of reading. Did you come yesterday? Okay, so then I will say this again. Allegory is, its conceptual meaning is spoken elsewhere. Spoken elsewhere, spoken perhaps therefore also by someone else. So generally speaking, one says allegory is when a system that is separate from the logical system is taken to mean the logical system. Like when you have in a B movie, two people talking, and the woman says, this is before the smoking prohibition, right? The woman says, who are you running away from? And they're not touching. The guy says, from myself. Give me a cigarette. And so the cigarette. And then suddenly cut, and then huge waves breaking on the shore. We know damn well what those waves breaking on the shore mean. Huh? Okay, so that is because they're in a very old allegorical system where those foam and breaking waves mean human copulation. So that's what an allegory is, right? Someone, like in all kinds of civilizations, breaking waves has meant this. It's not just a B movie today. And somehow you assume that the allegory will be understood. So what is an allegory then? An allegory is where the metaphor, waves breaking, and the concept, reproductive heteronormativity, male and female copulating with orgasm and ejaculation, concept and metaphor, they're working together. They are not canceling each other out. So therefore, what I was saying was that in my reading, dream, the waves breaking, and reason, the reasonable explanation, they were not canceling each other out, as they don't in powerful allegory. Symbolism is different. I'm not going there now. This is hardly the time to go into allegory and symbol. But at any rate, so I was saying that in my reading, and the way those people left in droves, they're not there yet. And Marxism needs this. One of the reasons why international socialism failed was because it didn't know how to dream. And so, to an extent, it made all of the dream into mere reasonable planning, and it failed. It couldn't touch the common person for that very reason. The machinery broke, they went toward capitalism in the most disgusting way. So therefore, when I was saying allegory of reading, I was meaning this way of dealing with two opposites, dream and reason, waves breaking and people screwing. That I was two different things, not canceling each other, but supporting each other. So more than this I cannot do. I hope I have earned my supper. Thank you.